Welcome to Employee Termination Tips. My name is Christopher Neufeld of Neufeld Legal. And in this particular video, we're going to be discussing whether or not your pay statement is wrong. And when it is wrong, what does it mean for you as an employee? And in particular, for those employees who have been terminated, fired, or quit their jobs, and whether or not there is something more that they should be seeking from their former employer. Now, we're looking at it from the Canadian perspective, and in particular with respect to Alberta employees. But you have to remember, and this is something that payroll systems and payroll companies and internal payroll operations of most companies in Canada fail to recognize. It seems that most employment lawyers fail to recognize is there are at least 15 different pay systems for employee pay in Canada. And apparently, all too often, all the employers are apparently using one employee pay system. And that employee pay system, all too often, is not even a Canadian pay system to start off with. So what does that mean? And what are the implications of that with respect to your pay statements? It means that all too often what we find is that there's inconsistencies with respect to employee payroll and therefore underpayments of employee pay. And how do you discern this? Well, it starts off with the employee pay statement and scrutinizing this. And as I've said before, and I see it many times, it's very difficult to understand this. And employment lawyers, for the most part, seem to be missing the boat on this also. In the fact that they have to scrutinize it in accordance with the laws of the prevailing jurisdiction. And what we're going to be looking at in this particular video is a situation from the standpoint of Alberta. And that means looking at a pay statement in accordance with the Alberta Employment Standards Code. Because that is the law that dictates what must be included in a pay statement for an Alberta employee. And there are the requirements that we're looking at emanate from Section 14 Sub 2 of the Alberta Employment Standards Code, which requires that the recording information from Section 14.1 of the Alberta Employment Standards Code are listed in a pay statement. And there are two critical aspects to this. And those are paragraphs B and C of Section 14 Sub 1 of the Alberta Employment Standards Code. So let's start off with Section 14 Sub 1, paragraph C. And that paragraph states, earnings paid showing separately each component of the earnings for each pay period. So what does this exactly mean? Well, we have to look at the definition of what is earnings. And this is defined at Section 1, Sub 1, paragraph J of the Alberta Employment Standards Code, which means wages, overtime pay, vacation pay, general holiday pay, and termination pay. So each of these aspects must be separately set out in one's pay statement. So if you actually look at your pay statement, all too often you don't have a component called wages. You have a lot of components, but none are specifically wages. This is a very big indicator that something's not right. Because unlike in, let's say, the province of Ontario or anywhere in the United States, where there is no requirement to list out the component known as wages, in Alberta, you are specifically required to specify what someone's wages are. And what are wages in Alberta? Wages are a composite of all remuneration as defined by Section 1, Sub 1, paragraph X of the Alberta Employment Standards Code. And this is a very expansive definition, which captures a lot of elements. It doesn't just capture your salary or your hourly pay. It also includes any bonuses that you were paid at that time, any permissible allowances that you were paid, any employer contributions. So what we're talking about with respect to employer contributions is pension contributions from your employer, RSP contributions from your employer, insurance, medical benefits, dental benefits. All these aspects have to be added together and put into one number. It doesn't say that you can break all these parts about and allow the employee to try to identify which ones forms part of wages. No. What it's saying is that you have to specify what the wages are. And that means you have to the employer has to take all those numbers, put those numbers into one component, and identify it as wages. And when you don't see that listed on the pay statement, that's a question for you as to whether or not it's being done correctly. Or is it in fact being done in accordance with the laws of another jurisdiction, which is very problematic. Now here's another thing that you sometimes see missing for salaried employees. There's never a listing of vacation pay. Now, it may seem innocuous because you go on vacation, you continue to get paid. But that's something that's permissible in other jurisdictions. This is not those other jurisdictions. We're talking about Alberta in this circumstance. And as such, if you go through a year's worth of pay statements, and especially if you look at the final year-end pay statement, and you're a salaried employee and you don't see anything setting out vacation pay for that year, there is a serious problem there. Because have you in fact been paid your vacation pay? And it's quite possible you were not. You might have been paid something else. But vacation pay, was that paid to you? Open question, something you have to scrutinize. Now let's shift on to the other missing component from pay statements in Alberta. And that's found in section 14 sub 1 paragraph B, which is a requirement that you list out one's wage rate and one's overtime rate. And the fact is, most people look at their pay statements and they see oftentimes an hourly rate if they're working an hourly basis, and they see an overtime rate that's 1.5 times their hourly rate. But is this in fact correct? Is this really your wage rate? And then if it is not your wage rate, is overtime being correctly calculated? That's the question you have to ask yourself. Because when we look at the definition of wage rate in the Alberta Employment Standards Code, which is found at section 1 sub 1 paragraph Y of the Alberta Employment Standards Code, it says wage rate is your hourly rate of pay for wages. And going back to our previous discussion as to what are wages, wages are not simply your base hourly pay or your salary. Wages are, in fact, a whole bunch of other aspects that are paid to you. So if your pay statement is simply you're getting paid $15 or $20 or $25 an hour and nothing else, that might be correct. But if you look at most pay statements that most people are getting paid, there's a whole bunch of other numbers there. There's employer contributions, there's allowances, every once in a while there are bonuses that are being provided. There's a whole lot of numbers there. And all those numbers, at least some of them, in the province of Alberta at least, go into wages and arguably go into wage rate. Now, this might not be the case in Ontario, and this might not be the case in the United States. But if you're working in Alberta, You're not supposed to be using the laws of some other province or even some other country. So you got to find out what the hourly rate that you're getting paid wages is. Not what your base hourly pay is. Not what your base salary rate is. What the wage rate is. And that has to be listed. So you see straight line, straight time, hourly rate, regular rate. You see that all too often in these pay statements. But do you see the word wage rate? I question it. It's all too often it's not there. Most of the time it's not there. And if you don't have that wage rate, you're probably not having the correct overtime rate. Because now we look at section 22 sub 1 of the Alberta Employment Standards Code. And it says overtime rate that is at least 1.5 times the employee's wage rate. Once again, there's nothing about hourly rate there. It's about wage rate. So now I'm going to try to shock you. Let's say that somebody is making $40 an hour base hourly rate. But then we have all these other components. We have permissible allowances. Let's even forget about bonuses. And we got employer contributions to either a pension plan or RSP plan, some matching arrangement. We got health benefits, dental benefits, what's known as some insurance benefits, AD&D, that are being paid by the employer. And you might see all these components spread out in a standard pay statement. But if you add up those components, just say for purpose of articulation, they represent another $10 of pay per hour. Well, what you find now is you've got an hourly rate of $40 an hour, but you have a wage rate of $50 an hour. And if you were to take the non-Alberta, maybe even non-Canadian approach to it, and take your overtime based on 1.5 times your hourly rate, your overtime rate is $60 an hour. But going according to the laws of Alberta, you got to have your $50 an hour wage rate and a minimum of 1.5 times that, which results in an overtime rate of $75 an hour. And what does this mean? Well, it means that you're getting underpaid overtime to the tune of $15 an hour. And that's every overtime hour that you work. You're getting shortchanged by $15, which can be quite significant to a lot of Alberta employees. This is earned money that you've earned. And if this stuff is not properly set out in your pay statement, this is a very serious problem for you. And especially when you leave the job, because this is typically the only time that you're able to challenge your employer without losing your job, you have a very serious issue. So these are the two aspects you start off by looking at. Whether or not wages are properly listed, and whether or not wage rate is listed, and in turn overtime rate is listed properly. Because when these aspects are missing from your pay statement, you got a very serious issue on your hands. And you're getting potentially significantly underpaid. And there's a lot of money that could well be owing to you from your employer. You can't just simply sit back. You got to take action. Well, you might not be able to take action when you're working for them. You got to keep records. You got to talk to a lawyer and position yourself. So when you do lose your job, whether you leave it, you get fired, you get terminated, you can take immediate action on this kind of stuff. You can collect what's been properly earned and owing to yourself. Because this is protected by law, by statute, under the Alberta Employment Standards Code. You can't just sit idly by because you've earned that money. And then for this very reason, identifying some of these key components in your pay statements is extremely important. And this is just the perspective for Alberta. Because as I said, in Canada, we have at least 15 different employee pay systems in play, mainly backed by statute. So a lot of employees are failing to appreciate and deal with the fact that their pay statements could very well be wrong, and in turn, their pay could be seriously discounted, such that they've earned money that they have not received from their employer, and they need to pursue that money because it's their legal entitlement by the laws that oversee their employment. So something that we look at and something that you should be looking at. Thank you.